Hi, everybody. When I lived in Northern Ireland for 1 year, yes, I did live in Northern Ireland for 1 year, there was a local band, Christian band from Belfast, who had a song explode in popularity, largely because the very well-known Christian singer Chris Tomlin picked it up, which of course made it a global hit in church communities. And that was the song God of the City, written by a band from Belfast named Blue Tree, with a chorus, "Greater things have yet to come, greater things are still to be done in this city." And that idea that greater things are yet to come comes, I'm pretty sure, from the verse that we're going to be looking at today. Now, to review a little bit what we've talked about in the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at the story of the people of Israel as they returned from the Babylonian captivity, the Babylonian exile in the Old Testament. Again, Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdom of Babylon came into Jerusalem, crushed the city, and destroyed the temple. This happened in about 586 or 587 BC. After several decades in exile, the king of Persia, King Cyrus, who then has risen up as sort of the world-dominating force, Persia sort of overpowered Babylon in that intervening period. Cyrus lets the people of Israel, the captives, the exiles, go back to Jerusalem, where he says they can rebuild the temple. Last week, we looked at Ezra chapter 3, which showed us what it looked like when they rebuilt the foundations of the temple, and how some of the people were rejoicing, and some of the older people who remembered what Solomon's temple had looked like before were weeping. So they were simultaneously rejoicing and weeping. And we use this as a way to think about our current circumstance in the midst of the pandemic and so many of the restrictions that have even affected the way we worship. The masking, the lower numbers, the lack of singing with the same sort of jubilant volume that we're used to singing in. That it seems like the way things are now is not as good as the way things are before. We're happy to be worshiping. We're sad that it's not the same. So we're going to be talking about the same story, the same context, the same period of history in the Old Testament today. And the verses that we're going to be looking at sort of encompass last week's story. So they set up things before, and then they follow up with things after. And instead of looking at the book of Ezra, we're going to be jumping into the book of Haggai. Now, Haggai was a prophet who was living, working, ministering at the same time that this is all going on. So even though these books are far apart in your Old Testament, they're happening at the same time. Haggai is one of what we call the minor prophets, not because he's unimportant, but because we divide the prophetic books in the Old Testament into major prophets and minor prophets. The major prophets are longer, the minor prophets are shorter. And in fact, Haggai, at only 2 chapters, is the second shortest book in the Old Testament after Obadiah. So I'm going to jump into the Bible here and look at Haggai chapter 1, verse 2. And what has happened is the Israelite captives have come back to Jerusalem. They've been living there. And this is what we read. It says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says through the prophet Haggai. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built." So again, this is before last week's story of laying the foundations for the temple. They have come back and they have started building their own houses, but they have not rebuilt the Lord's temple, which is what God gets at the next verse here, verse 3. "Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains in ruin, referencing the Lord's house?" So they've come back and they've started building their own houses. They were building their own lives, and yet the Lord's house hasn't been rebuilt. And this is a problem. This is not the way it should be. They're not giving priority to God's place as the center of their community, the center of their lives, the way they should. They're trying to get their own lives going first. And here's what they come up with. They come up with empty, insufficient lives. And this is what God points out in the following verses. It says, "Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways." You have planted much, but you have harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. You hear all these metaphors of you're trying to come up with something, but you're falling short. Your life is not matching up to what you're hoping. You're hoping to have fullness, satisfaction, peace, security, and you're always feeling empty. I'm going to use a big word, there's an existential void. There's a hole in your life because you're trying to build your own houses and leave God out of your life until later. This is a problem. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And that's why your lives are feeling empty, is what God says through the prophet Haggai. So, God's message through the prophet to these people is build the house. Build the house of the Lord. Rebuild the temple. Put that back in the center of your community. Put that back in the center of your lives. And through the encouragement, the push of God's Holy Spirit, the leaders and the people obey the prophet Haggai. The whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, and they start rebuilding the house. But we saw last week what that looked like as they rebuild that foundation. And the prophet Haggai, and I think I read this verse in last week's video as well, hits the nail on the head, God's voice through the prophet, when he says, and this is in chapter 2, if you want to look up these verses, chapter 2, verse 3, God says, "Who of you is left who saw this house?" That's a reference to the temple. "Who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory?" So the older exiles, the people who are maybe 70, 75 years old, who can remember how amazing Solomon's temple was in Jerusalem before Nebuchadnezzar came and crushed the whole city and his army destroyed that temple. They can remember the beauty, the glory of that temple. Who among you is left who saw this house in its former glory? And then the question, how does it look to you now? As you see it being rebuilt, as you see the foundations laid, does it not seem to you like nothing? It doesn't match up. The older generation who can remember what it was before are looking at what's here now and saying, this is nothing. It's not what it's supposed to be. It's not what we wanted. And of course, last week, as I said a moment ago, we use that to think of what it's like to worship now in the context of the pandemic. It's not the same. It's not the way we want it to be. But God lays out an amazing and surprising promise and declaration in the midst of that context. And this is moving a little bit farther in Haggai chapter 2. This is probably the most famous, well-known verse from Haggai. If you know any verse from Haggai, it's probably this one. And this is also the verse that was behind that song that I talked about at the very beginning of our video about greater things are yet to come. Greater things have still to be done. Here's what God says through the prophet Haggai in chapter 2, verse 9. The glory of this present house doesn't seem like much in your eyes if you saw the old one. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace. Here you see the mighty promise and declaration of the Lord in the face of disappointment and grief. You're thinking the best was behind us, the best was back then, and God says, that's not true. The glory of this present house, small though it seems in your eyes, is going to be even greater than the glory of the former house, the old house. How can God say that? Well, the answer rests, I think, in verse 7, a verse that I didn't read. We skipped over it. But if we go back to verse 7, here's what God says through the prophet Haggai. I will shake all the nations, and the desired of all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory. The desired of all the nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory. Now, I know that we are a little bit far away from Advent yet. We're just in early October. We're not quite in the Advent season. But Charles Wesley picks up that phrase, the desired of all the nations, in his Advent hymn, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. And here's what he writes: Israel's strength and consolation, hope of all the earth thou art, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart. What that points to is that Jesus Christ is the desire of every nation. And the way that God can say, the former house, the glory of the former house will be more than, the glory of the present house will be more than the glory of the former house, is because this house is moving towards Jesus. So don't think that the greatest things are in the past, because the greatest things are yet to come. And you know what? Even despite what things look like to us now, that still holds. That's still true. That if we are following Jesus, if we are moving towards Christ, the best things are not in the past. The best things are in the future. It's not about the brick and mortar. The brick and mortar of Solomon's temple was so much more amazing than of the next temple. The panels of cedar, wood, whatever, maybe not actual bricks and mortar. But the construction of the former temple was more amazing than of the second temple. And yet God says the second temple is moving towards Christ. Greater things are coming out of this one. And like I say, it's the same with our current situation. If we are moving towards Christ, the greatest things are not behind us. The greatest things are in front of us. Despite the volume of singing on Sunday morning, despite the numbers, if we as a church community are following Christ, moving towards Christ, the greatest things are not behind us. The greatest things are in front of us. And that goes for this life and the life to come. The call on the Christian life is to be moving towards Jesus, to be following Jesus, to be a disciple each day of the week and in our worship together on Sundays. So I want to encourage you with that message that God makes that bold promise, despite what things look like to us, that the greatest things are not behind us. The greatest things are in front of us if we are following Jesus Christ. Have a great week, and we will see you soon.